Sawney Beane, the Man-Eater, by Charles Whitehead. Our next narrative presents such a picture of human barbarity that, were it not attested by the most unquestionable historical evidence, it would be rejected as altogether fabulous and incredible. It is that of Sawney Beane. This man was born in East Lothian, about 8 miles east of Edinburgh, in the reign of James the First of Scotland. His father was a hedger and ditcher, and brought up his son to the same laborious employment. Naturally idle and vicious, he abandoned that place in company with a young woman equally idle and profligate, and retired to the deserts of Galloway, where they took up their habitation by the seaside. The place which they selected for their dwelling was a cave of about a mile in length, and of considerable breadth, so near the sea that the tide often penetrated into the cave above 200 yards. The entry had many intricate windings and turnings, leading to the extremity of the subterraneous dwelling, which was literally the habitation of horrid cruelty. In this cave they commenced their depredations, and to prevent the possibility of detection, they murdered every person they robbed. Destitute of the means of obtaining any other food, they resolved to live upon human flesh, and accordingly, when they had murdered any man, woman, or child, they carried them into their den, quartered them, salted the limbs, and dried them for food. In this manner they lived, carrying on their depredations and murder until they had 8 sons and 6 daughters, 18 grandsons and 14 granddaughters, all the offspring of incest. But though they soon became numerous, yet such was the multitude which fell into their hands, that they had often superabundance of provisions, and would be at a distance from their own habitation, throw legs and arms of dried human bodies into the sea by night. These were often cast out by the tide, and taken up by the country people, to the great dismay of all the surrounding inhabitants. Nor could anyone discover what had befallen the many friends, relations, and neighbors who had unfortunately fallen into the hand of these merciless cannibals. In proportion as Sawney's family increased, every one that was able acted in his part in these horrid assassinations. They would sometimes attack 4 or 6 men on foot, but never more than 2 upon horseback. To prevent the possibility of escape, they would lie in ambush in every direction, so that if they escaped the attack of the first, they might be assailed with renewed fury by the second party, and inevitably murdered. By this means they always secured their prey, and prevented detection. At last, however, the vast number who were slain raised the inhabitants of the country, and all the woods and lurking places were carefully searched. Yet, though they often passed by the mouth of the horrible den, it was never once suspected that any human being resided there. In this state of uncertainty and suspense concerning the authors of such frequent massacres, several innocent travelers and innkeepers were taken up on suspicion because the persons who were missing had been last seen in their company, or had last resided at their houses. The effect of this well-meant and severe justice constrained the greater part of the innkeepers in those parts to abandon such employments, to the great inconvenience of those who travelled through that district. Meanwhile, the country became depopulated, and the whole nation was at a loss to account for the numerous and unheard-of villainies and cruelties that were perpetrated, without the slightest clue to the discovery of the abominable actors. At length the horrible scene was terminated in the following manner. One evening a man and wife were riding home upon the same horse from a fair which had been held in the neighborhood, and being attacked, the husband made the most vigorous resistance. His wife, however, was dragged from behind him, carried to a little distance, and her entrails instantly taken out. Struck with horror, the husband redoubled his efforts to escape, and even trod some of the assassins down under his horse's feet. Fortunately for him and the inhabitants of that part of the country, in the meantime 20 or 30 in a company came riding home from the fair, but upon their approach Sawney and his bloody crew fled into a thick wood and hastened to their infernal den. This man, who was the first that had ever escaped out of their hands, related to his neighbors what had happened, and showed them the mangled body of his wife lying at a distance, the bloodthirsty wretches not having time to carry it along with them. They were all struck with astonishment and horror, took him with them to Glasgow, and reported the whole adventure to the chief magistrate of the city, who upon this information instantly wrote to the king, informing him of the matter. In a few days his majesty in person, accompanied by 400 men, went in quest of the perpetrators of these horrid cruelties. The man whose wife had been murdered before his eyes went as their guide, with a great number of bloodhounds, that no possible means might be left unattempted to discover the haunt of such execrable villains. They searched the woods, and traversed and examined the seashore, but as they passed by the entrance into their cave, some of the bloodhounds entered it, and raising an uncommon barking and noise gave indication that they were about to seize their prey. The king and his men returned, but could scarcely conceive how any human beings could reside in a place of utter darkness, and where the entrance was difficult and narrow. But as the bloodhounds increased in their vociferation and refused to return, it occurred to all that the cave ought to be explored to the extremity. Accordingly, a sufficient number of torches was provided, the hounds were permitted to pursue their course, a great number of men penetrated through all the intricacies of the path, and at length arrived at the private entrance of the cannibals. They were followed by all the band, who were shocked to behold a sight unequalled in Scotland, if not in any part of the universe. Legs, arms, thighs, hands, and feet of men, women, and children were suspended in rows like dried beef. Some limbs and other members were soaked in pickle, while a great mass of money, both of gold and silver, watches, rings, pistols, clothes, both linen and woolen, with an immense quantity of other articles, were either thrown together in heaps or suspended upon the sides of the cave. The whole cruel, brutal family, to the number formerly mentioned, were seized, the human flesh buried in the sand of the seashore, the immense booty carried away, and the king marched to Edinburgh with the prisoners. This new and wretched spectacle attracted the attention of the inhabitants, who flocked from all quarters to see as they passed along so bloody and unnatural a family, which had increased in the space of 25 years to the number of 27 men and 21 women. Arrived in the capital, they were all confined in the toll booth under a strong guard, and were next day conducted to the common place of execution in Leith Walk, and executed without any formal trial, it being deemed unnecessary to try those who were avowed enemies of all mankind and of all social order. The enormity of their crimes dictated the severity of their death. The men had their entrails thrown into the fire, their hands and legs were severed from their bodies, and they were permitted to bleed to death. The wretched mother of the whole crew, the daughters and grandchildren, after being spectators of the death of the men, were cast into 3 separate fires and consumed to ashes. Nor did they, in general, display any signs of repentance or regret, but continued, with their last breath, to pour forth the most dreadful curses and imprecations upon all around.